In this video, I'll go through a demo of my version of the week 1 assignment, Drawing with Code. Now, of course, you don't have to take the same approach that I'm doing here, but I find it's nice, especially when working remotely, to be able to see a sort of start to finish version of going through one of our assignments. So I have started on the right-hand side of the screen here in Illustrator, sketching out a composition that is a self-portrait. You can see it's kind of stylized, and I've mostly used fairly simple shapes, things like circles, ellipses, straight lines. Probably the most complicated shapes are the little hair clumps here. Those I just drew out with the pen tool as some 4-segment Bezier curves. I like to do it like this because I find Illustrator pretty easy to work in, and the translation of shapes and the translation of coordinates from Illustrator into P5.js is very straightforward and very intuitive. Now, of course, you don't have to approach the assignment like this. You could make a completely different composition. You could take one of the different themes. You could draw your sketch completely analog. You could do it on graph paper, for instance, or just on regular paper, and then use a ruler to measure. It's going to take a little bit more conversion, but it really just depends on what you're comfortable with. So let's break down how this composition is set up. And in Illustrator, I have 3 panels open that are going to be super helpful for getting our composition info from Illustrator into P5. First one is the Layers panel. Second one is the Transform panel. And the third one is the Info panel. So you can find all these under the Window menu and just pull them up, arrange them however you want in the interface. Now, as far as layering, I have a stack of layers here, starting with the shirt here. So if I turn all these others off, you can see I've got the shirt, the collar, the neck, the ears, and so on and so forth. So I'm sort of building from the background to the foreground based on the way my layers are stacking. Now, one of the tricky things about going into P5 from Illustrator is that the way the layering works, it's kind of the opposite. So the things that are drawn earlier in our code are in the background, and the things that are drawn later in our code are in the foreground. So we'll just have to keep that in mind as we go through working here. So also to make things easier on myself here, I made sure to make my document in Illustrator the same pixel dimensions as what I'll be using in P5. So this is 360 by 640 pixels, and I'll need to make sure that I mirror that in P5. So over on the left-hand side of the screen in my browser, I've got a new blank sketch, and I'll go ahead and make my canvas 360 by 640. And the reason we're using that size is it's a really common aspect ratio for smartphones and other mobile devices. So even though the pixel dimensions are a little bit smaller than what most mobile devices can display, the proportions are the same. So we'll be able to scale up or scale down to adjust for different devices. So first thing I'm going to do here is just map out using comments all the layers that I'll plan to take from Illustrator. And again, I'm starting in reverse order here. So I want to start with the bottom layer in Illustrator and work my way backwards. Okay, so I've gotten all of my commented layers into P5. This will give me a really nice roadmap to make sure that I copy in all my shapes and sort of know where I'm at in my composition as I'm working. I'm just going to start at the top here. So let's figure out how to translate that shirt shape from Illustrator into P5. And I can see here back in Illustrator, I have an ellipse that is making up that shape. I can tell, obviously, just by looking at it from the shape, it's an ellipse, it's an oval. I can also tell by the fact that when I've selected it with the black selection cursor, up in the top left corner, this is telling me this is an ellipse. So for shapes that are sort of regular geometric shapes, things like ellipses, circles, squares, rectangles, I can use the Transform panel to take out some of their properties and translate those coordinates into P5 really easily. So I've got this shape selected. I'm going to go ahead and zoom my screen in here just so we can see a little bit more clearly how this Transform panel is set up. So the first thing I want to pay attention to is the reference point. And that tells me right now, because the center is highlighted, that the coordinates for the X and Y locations I'm going to get are going to correspond to the center of that shape. So if I were to switch it to the upper right hand corner, these coordinates would represent the upper right hand coordinate of the shape. So I can see here from the X and Y, this is 189, 604. So those are the coordinates that I need to take in to P5 to my ellipse function to set the center point of the ellipse. And then I have here the width and the height, so about 487, 372. And then this isn't rotated, but if I had rotated that shape in Illustrator, I could see that rotation angle here in this one. Okay, let me zoom back out. Let's go ahead and make ourselves an ellipse. And again, I'm just copying in those coordinates. So this is 189, 604. It's going to give me the center point. And then the width is 487, 372. Let's go ahead and play our sketch. And I've got auto refresh checked, so we'll be able to update as we go. So I can see here, I have made that shape. I need to also grab the fill and the stroke settings so that I can get my colors correct. So for that, all I need to do is with that shape selected, I can double click on the color picker in Illustrator, and I can see here under my different numeric color settings, the R, the G, the B. So those three numbers are going to make up my color settings. So the red is 125, green is 0, blue is 135. So let's come back here. Let's set the fill. So that's going to be 125, 0, 135. And this does not have a stroke on it, so I'll use this no stroke function. Whoops. Make sure we spell it right. Okay, so there is my shirt. And so again, for any of our regular shapes, ellipses, rectangles, straight lines, we can really easily copy in those coordinates. I'm going to spend some time doing that. When we get to some of the more complex shapes, we'll break down how to attack those. Okay, so we've made some good progress here drawing out our basic sort of two-dimensional primitive shapes from Illustrator to P5. Now at this point, I'd like to tackle this beard shape. And so this is not a regular geometric shape. This is one that I drew out with the pen tool. So it's made up of, I can see 1, 2, 3 Bezier curves. And we're going to tackle this a slightly different way by starting in P5. So we're going to start with the begin shape and end shape functions. And this is same exact approach that we go over in the How to Draw Bezier Curves demo video for this week. So the difference here, rather than clicking on this and using the transform panel, I need to actually get the locations of the individual vertices that are making the curves in this shape. So for that, I'm going to switch to the pen tool. And this is where I need to bring up the info from my info panel rather than the transform panel. So all I need to do is pick a starting point. And you can see as I'm moving my pen tool around, the location on the info panel is changing. So I can mouse right over an anchor point or a control handle and get the exact locations that I'd like for that point. So I can see this is about 67x, about 298y. I'm going to take that point, copy it into P5 and rinse and repeat. Okay, so there you can see I've built out that sort of more customized Bezier shape using my 3 Bezier curves, and I'm using 1 Bezier vertex call for each one of those segments. So again, in Illustrator, you can see here 1, 2, 3. And one other interface tool in Illustrator that makes this a little bit easier is under View, make sure my Smart Guides are active. So that way, when I need to snap right to one of these anchor points or control handles, I can mouse right over it and make sure I'm exactly snapping to that point. And again, take a review of the how to draw Bezier curves in P5 if you want a little bit more detail on this process. So I'm just going to continue here, drawing out my basic shapes, drawing out my custom shapes using arcs and or Bezier curves, just porting from Illustrator to P5. So at this point, I've gone ahead and used a triangle function to draw out the larger part of the nose. And now I'm here in P5. I've used a Bezier function call to draw out the little arc that's underneath it. And I'm just going back to Illustrator here to figure out the stroke weight that I'd like to apply to the line that's making that shape. So I've selected that path here, and I can see the stroke weight. It's about 4.8. So I'm just going to call that 5. And let's just make sure that's looking okay. So I can see I've got a little bit of a gap here. I either want to make that stroke weight heavier or maybe just bump up that nose a little bit more. Let's try 10. So maybe a little too much. So maybe split the difference here. So if I want to bump this arc up a little bit, I just need to go through every one of the y coordinates of all these points in my Bezier function and just subtract. So I'm going to take away 5 pixels from each one of those. And maybe that's a little bit too much, but you get the point. We can make adjustments here as we go. Another thing that you may have noticed me doing as I'm building up this composition is being pretty redundant about my stroke and fill and no stroke and no fill settings. That makes it a lot easier to repeat those again and again, to readjust my layers if I need to. So if I find that I need to maybe insert some shapes between the layers that I've already set up in P5, it's much easier to do that. So I'm just going to keep plugging here. And hopefully you're getting some idea of how to approach this. So at this point, I'm working on the eyebrows, and I want to make sure that I copy the end cap style that I've set up in Illustrator. So I'd like it flat at the end, not rounded over. And I don't remember offhand how to set that up. So I'm jumping into the P5JS reference, looking up this command for stroke cap. So let's click in there and see what our options are. Okay, so we could set a round, a square, or a projection mode. And I'd like square in this instance. That's looking good. And now, since I've set this once, I need to go back to these other 2 stroke shapes and make sure I set the cap style to round, because I do want those to be round. Now, so far, I've drawn out 3 of these little sort of curly hair clumps, and rather than going back and forth between Illustrator, copying the same points again, I'm just adding about 70 pixels to the horizontal, the X component for each of my points from the original shape. And, you know, it's about the same amount of work versus going back and forth and copying all the points from Illustrator. So just going through here, adding 70 to each of the horizontal coordinate arguments. Okay, so just putting the last finishing touches on the smile lines here. I had to do a little bit of tweaking, and that's pretty normal. The idea when you're coding is to try to set things up as flexibly as possible so that if you do come to have to make changes, it's not that big of a deal. So this is looking pretty good. All of my layering and my coloring looks correct. The sizing is correct. And in a different video, we'll cover what we need to do to get this to run full screen on a mobile device.